Resident Evil 4, when released in 2005, is an interesting piece of gaming history as it presented a new concept that greatly impacted the future of the video games industry and where it would go from there. It became an evolution of the series that set the standard for the survival horror genre, while changing its direction slightly with more action-focused gameplay, but still managed to balance the visible horror elements of previous titles to present one of gaming's greatest ever experiences even to the current day. Its recent remake is equally as memorable, bringing fans old and new into the realm of survival horror once more. While the game has an impressive history, its original development is just as interesting, that tried to combine elements of old while adding new ideas, many of which would find their way into the 2005 release, with the over-the-shoulder combat mechanics. However, the early prototypes of RE4, which is mostly known these days as Resident Evil 3.5, used the same explorative style of fixed cameras used in the early games, but transitioned to this new perspective for the combat, which would have been the first to use two separate play styles in one sitting, seen in the series at that time. If we go back over the last 2 decades, the internet was abound with leaked images and gameplay trailers of this version that generated much excitement among survival horror fans. But the game would change course during development, very like what happened with the development of Resident Evil 2, having an almost completely different version, which was near completion before being scrapped in favour of the classic version we got to play all those years ago. This early prototype of Resident Evil 4 is interesting as it is very dark and atmospheric, more so than what we saw in the final release in 2005, seeing Leon starting off in a mansion hallway with a similar layout to the Spencer mansion seen in the original Resident Evil on the PlayStation and Resident Evil Code Veronica. The layout of this version of the mansion is more similar to the Lost in Nightmares DLC on Resident Evil 5 that allowed you to play in co-op with both Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine, which would act as the precursor to the events of the main game. Unlike previous or recent Resident Evil games, this outing presented some interesting elements mentioned in the early trailers. These elements play with your psyche as things can change in your environment, from hallways being blocked that would normally be accessible to your mind playing tricks with what is real and what isn't. You also have the usual backtracking, which is necessary to solve puzzles you will face on your journey. But as you explore deeper into the mansion, you will be greeted with rooms, hallways, corridors and scenes that are familiar to those that played 2005's Resident Evil 4, with some subtle visual changes, but many of these scenes would make their way into the castle section later on in the final release. As this is a fan-made prototype, there aren't many enemies that you will face, but it is eerie, with plenty of atmosphere and tension in abundance, which makes the experience all the more interesting.
A doll? The missing arm.
This is one of the only known playable versions of the game out there, and can be difficult to find, but you can gain access to it if you know where to look. There is very little else regarding the information available if there will be any future updates on this, but at least this version provides a glimpse of what could have been, and that's what makes the history surrounding these games so interesting, as it can open up many more questions and possibilities, or even provide incentives for fans to create their own games in this style, which we can only hope to see in the future. But in the meantime, I would recommend you give it a try, if you can, just to witness some of those early ideas behind one of the greatest games ever made. And if you would like to see more games inspired by the classic Resident Evil series, then this next video will give fans more of what they are looking for.